Scripture reading today is Matthew 14, verses 13 to 21. Feeding the 5,000. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in the boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go to the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fishes." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
It worries me sometimes that the stories that we tell are so familiar, they don't speak to us anymore. It worries me sometimes. And then other times I hear, and you'll recognize this because, whenever you have family, especially if you have a big family, whenever you have family around, they're always telling stories about each other. Remember that time? You remember? Remember? And each time you hear that story, it gets better. Or more elaborate, or more embarrassing, or more awkward. There's more to it each time it's retold. And sure, okay, sometimes that's a bad thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing because it takes on a life of its own and it gets away from you. But sometimes, I think the reason why people do that is it's not because the story wasn't great the first time around. It's that they're afraid that since they're telling it again and they know you've darn well heard this before, you're not going to listen. So they're throwing a little something else. Just makes it a little bit more interesting. The point is still there. The truth or whatever really happened there, you hope, is still there, but they just want to make it a little bit more interesting so it grabs your attention. How many times have you heard this story about Jesus feeding the multitude? We even call it that, Jesus feeds the multitude. How many times have you heard this story? Well, it's in all 4 Gospels, right? So you may also know the version of the story where it's a little boy that has the loaves and fishes, right? Because apparently his mother was smart enough to pack a lunch for him. Which is the weird thing about this story is that these people have come to see Jesus. He's been healing people, and he's been teaching, and so he's got cool things to say as well as he's doing cool stuff. And they come to see him. And what's really missing from this story is vendors. You know as well as I do, if you're going to a big event where there's loads of people, whether it's like the Ponoka Stampede, for instance, or Big Valley Jamboree that's on this weekend, you know as well as I do, there's vendors. And they're selling food, all sorts of different kinds of food. But there's also people, they're selling, leather goods, T-shirts, cool stuff that goes with whatever's going on, right? And if these people have started to follow Jesus around because he heard he's doing cool things, you know that sooner or later there's somebody who's gone, hey, those people are going to have to eat. Or maybe they want to get the T-shirt. There's vendors missing from this story. The fact that the disciples go, send them away so they can go into town and get stuff, it's also kind of, makes me kind of, because, in those days, if you were going somewhere, you didn't go without food. Because wherever you went, it took you ages to get there. Right? Because the odds are really good that the people Jesus was talking to wouldn't have had a donkey or a horse or any kind of thing like that. They would have walked everywhere. And if you're walking everywhere, especially somewhere where it's, say, really hot, you're going to take water and you're going to take food with you. You are. And not just, actually, that's that era. We don't now, right? Because you hop in the car and wherever you're going, you're there. Although I will say that I rarely come from Bashaw to Ponoka, or for that matter, go from Ponoka to Bashaw without I stop and get a coffee first. I don't go anywhere in the car without, if it's more than 15 minutes, I got to have a coffee. We don't necessarily do that thing where we package up something to take on our trip because we're getting there faster. We might get a coffee or a drink or something, but we don't. Unless the other day I heard two parents talking about separate families about their kids, and they'd been on somewhere together. They'd gone cycling or something together, and the one was saying to the other, "I'm so glad you totally saved me. Totally saved me because you brought snacks." Who goes out the door with their little kids without packing a snack first? Well, probably somebody who actually didn't anticipate they were going to be doing something else, right? But if you know you're going somewhere, if you got a little kid with you, you pack snacks because they're going to be hungry. And they're going to be hungry for something that's probably going to be outrageously expensive wherever you went, which is now we're back at the vendors, because if there had been vendors at this scene here with the multitude, they would have been charging a whole lot more than people could afford. So there's no vendors. There's no people who apparently thought they had to pack lunch, except in the version of the story where it's the little boy, which I find really kind of hard to believe. Which brings me to this story being a miracle story, because I think there's more than one miracle in this story. So first of all, there's two ways you can perceive this miracle. One is Jesus takes the loaves and the fishes, and instantly he is able to feed everyone. It is a miracle which proclaims Jesus, the Son of God, to be powerful, to be literally a miracle worker. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that interpretation. It makes the point that Jesus is significant and important. In and of itself, that's what the story does. It's a miracle. Jesus is Jesus, so of course he can do miracles. You could also look at this story and go, okay, so Jesus says, what do we got? Well, we got some loaves and we got some fishes. Okay, that's it? Yeah. Okay, let's share that. And as Jesus goes and shares that little bit of food and says, I'm sorry this is all we got, but, here, you take it. Other people are inspired to discover that, in fact, they did bring something. And they take out what little they have and go, you know what? I don't need all of this. I'll share. You have some. And that moves through the crowd, and everyone starts sharing because they're inspired by that first act that Jesus did of, I don't need it, you take it. Let's share. Now, you could hear that and go, well, you're just explaining away the miracle then. It's not a miracle anymore. Isn't it? When was the last time you were with a crowd of people where everyone shared everything they had? Okay, that wasn't church. That in itself is a miracle too. Jesus inspires sharing. It truly, honestly, it is. I'm not trying to explain away the story. I'm just saying that is a miracle too. And we really need to start believing in those kind of miracles, because you can do those miracles too. You can. Which is another miracle in the story, because the more I read this story and the more familiar it becomes to me, the more I read into this story that this isn't just a story about Jesus does a miracle or Jesus inspires a miracle. The part of this story that's truly critical is when the disciples say, send them away to get something to eat, and Jesus goes, you do it. You do it. Anybody hungry? Because I didn't bring any food. You do it. You share. Now, as it happens, I saw Leah and Sybil putting food out for after. But still, the point is that Jesus' initial response isn't, sure, Shazam, everyone shall be fed. His initial response is, you do it. That doesn't happen very often in miracle stories that we read. When Jesus gives sight to the blind or he casts out a demon, his first thought isn't, okay, disciple number 4, it's your turn. Step up. He does it. But that isn't what happens here with this great crowd of people. His first response is, no, you do it. We don't need to send them away. There's no 7-Eleven. There's no McDonald's in the closest town. You do it. And yet they don't. Well, I mean, they find the loaves and fishes. It still takes Jesus to make the inspiring act of sharing. Okay, the disciples are still learning, though. How many times do we have to hear this story before we learn? Right? You do it, I think, is the real message of this story. Because you can. And that's where that real miracle of inspiring people to share needs to become less of a miracle. We need to make that happen. And we need people to understand that they ought not to be surprised when it does. But that ought to be the norm. That ought to be how this goes. We feed each other. And not just in the very practical way of this story, of course. Because there's another miracle. It's the metaphor miracle, which is that Jesus doesn't just say, you do it, to go and feed hungry people. Share your food with others. Jesus means that about the gospel too. Jesus means that about his own teaching to you. I've showed you, now you go and do it. And when you do it, by the way, you're showing others too, right? So you'll be inspiring others. Everything about what Jesus lives, shows, and then tells the disciples. Remember at the end of John, where he's, love one another as I have loved you. I didn't just tell you, I showed you. Now go and do what I showed you. Right? Everything about that's in this story. You can do it. Look, I'll show you. You can do it. I'll show you. Everybody, here, I got some food. You take it. Now, you guys go and do that too. I think that's what happened in this story. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the interpretation that Jesus himself did this miracle and fed everybody. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. It makes the point about who Jesus is. Absolutely. But your takeaway from this story can't just be, that's who Jesus is. It's got to be, who am I, too? Who are you in this story? Are we one of the disciples that says, I don't know, like we better send them away because we got nothing? Or are we one of the people who's, say, number 3,472 in the crowd, who goes, hey, what's going on? You guys, oh, maybe I got something too. Hang on, let me look. That part of the story is actually really kind of hard for us to comprehend because we don't, like I said, we don't do that. We hop in the car and we can always stop somewhere. When you go on a trip, even if it's a trip of a few hours, don't you always go, well, we can stop in such and such a place and, hey, we stop there for lunch. They have good pie. Right? There's always somewhere to stop. Not so in this story. There isn't always somewhere to stop. People had food with them. Okay, so just explained away the reason why we don't have to have that same experience. Because we don't take food with us on a trip. No, we don't. But we also live in close proximity to people who don't have food. We also live in a world, on a planet, where it is not that hard for us to get food from the part of the world where the vast majority of it is consumed to that place, not to mention thrown away, to that place where people don't have any. It's just not that hard anymore. And yet, we seem to find that it is. Two pieces from this story. When Jesus says, you do it, Jesus literally means the practical aspect of feeding others. Of not just feeding others, perhaps, but you could even turn that into making sure that people have a home, somewhere to live, people have water. You going to share that? I don't know, you drank out of it. It's kind of, yeah. But see, that's the moment, though, isn't it? I know you would, by the way. I know you would. He absolutely would. But that's the moment. We need to seize those moments and actually do it. Not send people away or tell them to go somewhere else. We need to seize the moment and offer what we have. The other piece of this that's so important, of that practical side of things, is how little they had that in the hands of Jesus turned into something else. We can do that too. We can do that too. We can be like Jesus in this story. We can make little turn into something else. Partly in how we inspire others, partly in what we're able to do ourselves. Think of all of those many things that started out as one tiny little thought or one person doing something that then turned into everyone together working on it. Think of how often that happens in the world. All it takes is one person to get that started, and then it turns into something else. That's the very practical part of this story. The probably slightly less practical, that is an extraordinarily bad choice of words. Robin, that's terrible. Because it is practical, too, to say that Jesus wants you to share the story. It may not be physically feeding you. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. It's not physically feeding you, but it is practically nourishing you. Sharing this story inspires others. Living this story inspires others to live as Jesus teaches us to live, to share the stories, all of the stories of Jesus. And tell the story of Jesus your way. Oh, gee, how important is that? Oh, how awesomely important is that? Tell the story of Jesus your way by living as Jesus your way. We had an interesting experience in July. We had a week of, and you can see the evidence. We had a week of kids here telling them stories from the Bible about characters in the Bible who had particular kind of superpowers. And we had a week in Bashaw as well with the same program. And each day we told a story about character from the Bible who had a superpower. And of course, the superpowers aren't things like flying. And I won't sing you the song that we made up because, trust me, you don't want to hear the song. It's a little questionable, but still, it makes the point. Our superpowers aren't that we fly or we have super strength or X-ray vision. Our superpowers are kindness, caring, bravery, wisdom, love. And we told stories about characters in the Bible, and of course, the last day we talked about how Jesus has all of those superpowers. Jesus, like Superman, right? Has all the superpowers. And so do you, is the point from Jesus. So do you. So go and do what you can do what I do. Just go and do it. You have those superpowers. But we told stories about different characters, and one of which was David and Goliath. David is brave. David and Goliath, and you know the story of David and Goliath, right? David is a vegetarian, and he goes out to fight Goliath. By peeling a banana, he throws the banana peel on the ground. Goliath slips on it and falls, and then he hits him over the head with a turnip. That's how the story goes, isn't it? That's how my story goes. The way the story goes is that David uses a sling and a rock, hits Goliath in the middle of the forehead, he falls down, and then he cuts his head off with a sword. You want to tell that to 5-year-olds? Because you can, and lots of people do. But didn't we make the same essential truth clear in the story about using a banana peel and hitting him on the head with a turnip? By the way, it was originally a beet, but I hate beets. But we made the same point. David is brave and knows that God goes with him. That's his superpower. He had lots of other superpowers too, and we talked about that too. But remember that story about Solomon? How we know Solomon is wise? Because the 2 women come to him and they're fighting over a child. And what does Solomon do? Okay, first of all, it wasn't a child, it was a puppy. And when the women come with the puppy, Solomon says, well, you know what? Neither of you can have the puppy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send him to a shelter, and maybe he'll get picked by somebody, or probably, but probably not. And then, who knows what's going to happen to him. And then one of the women goes, no, he needs a home. Give him to that woman. And so Solomon knows to give the puppy to the woman who was willing to give him up so that he would have a home, rather than see him go to the shelter. That's how the story goes, right? Nope, it's a baby, and Solomon offers to cut it in half so they can each have half. You want to tell that story to a 5-year-old? Because you can, but you can make the same essential truth clear in other ways. This story may very well be a story of Jesus performing a great miracle, which, by the way, ought to inspire us into understanding that some of the other things that Jesus does, that the other pieces of the story that we know about Jesus' story, is worth being inspired by. The whole story itself is a miracle. But if you tell this as an inspirational story of Jesus inspires others to share, that too is a miracle. And one day, God willing, one day it won't be such a miracle. But which of those 2 stories inspires you most to action? Which of those ways of understanding that story inspires you most to want to take action? Because that's Jesus. That's what Jesus is all about. Inspiring you to take action. Inspiring you to be Jesus to others. You do it, because you can. You have a whole story here now that tells you, yes, you can. One day that's not going to be such a great miracle. Right now, maybe it is, trying to inspire people like that. But one day it's not going to be a miracle. And the miracle of this story is going to be that it's not a miracle. Because we're all doing it. We're all feeding each other. We're all feeding the hungry. We're all sharing the story of Jesus with those who hunger for that kind of connection, that kind of relationship. One day.